Hi, everybody. This is Katie Kessner, and welcome back to the Dear Katie podcast. We are so delighted to have your continued listenership and fellowship and this long journey of surviving, thriving, healing, and all the good things we like to do on the podcast. As a quick reminder, self-care is so critical. You can always push pause. You can come back at any time. And don't forget, there's tons of resources on the Take Back the Night website for survivors to venture into all kinds of modalities of healing and thriverships. The podcast is just one. Today, our special guest is Rachael Denhollander. Rachael is an attorney, an educator, author. She became internationally known as a whistleblower in the Larry Nassar case, which we're going to talk about in this episode for sure. Rachel's going to explain all about who Larry Nassar is and what happened and her involvement. So also about Rachael. Rachael works all over the country, probably throughout the world, to educate institutions about, I would say, generally sexual assault, sexual violence. And she especially is passionate about creating ethically guided and restorative institutional transformation processes, focusing on survivor healing and care, as well as genuine change within these institutions. Rachael engages with state legislatures on any legislation related to sexual assault and works alongside many law firms to seek more justice for survivors. So welcome, Rachael. Thank you for joining us today. Yeah, I'd like to start maybe just a little bit about where you grew up and what law school you went to, just so we know a little bit more about you.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in a little town in Michigan called Kalamazoo. Just had a wonderful childhood there, wonderful supportive family. It was just everything that it ought to be for the most part. I went to a law school out in California. It was primarily distance-based, and that allowed me to gain a lot of life experience and professional experience while I was pursuing my education. And so I became a member of the California Bar when I was 24. And then that just gave me a really great background for public policy work, communication work, legal work, and just really equipped me to do a wide variety of things.
Lovely. And did you have brothers and sisters growing up? Tell us a little bit more. What did you study? Were you always law-minded?
Absolutely. So I did. I have a younger brother and a younger sister. We're all really close. Really, again, just very grateful for that dynamic. And then I actually told my parents that I wanted to be an attorney when I was 10. And it really wasn't an abuse related thing. I know. My mom will tell you my proclivity for advocacy was evident at a very young age, which really meant that I was just very stubborn and argumentative as a child and just had a very strong sense of justice. And so when I was 10, I said, hey, I think I might want to be an attorney when I grow up, because I could just see already the impact that attorneys were able to have, especially on child protection, and just the way attorneys were in the room when policy was shaped and had an impact on the legislative processes. And they're your first call when a crime's been committed, right? There's so much that takes place in a law office or that's guided by legal counsel that even at a young age I could see. And so I was 10 when I first said, hey, I think I might want to be an attorney. And that was a passion that just really carried through. Yeah. So I can't say really at all that my abuse was responsible for the career path that I chose, but I can say that it just equipped me incredibly for being able to handle it and really just understanding the processes in ways that I wouldn't have if I hadn't had that background.
So let's talk about what you just referenced as the abuse part of your life. Most of our listeners are survivors or trying to support survivors and learning about advocacy as well. So share whatever you like to about that part of your life as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually first experienced sexual assault when I was around 7 years old in our church. There was a college student who was preying on myself and another little girl in the congregation. And through that process, I really got to experience both the incredibly redemptive aspect of adults who are well-trained, bystanders who are well-trained, and also what typically happens to survivors when they speak up. There was a group of advocates in our church who were trained sexual assault counselors, and they were watching this man with myself and with this other little girl. And they came to my parents. They said, hey, we're seeing some red flags here. We're seeing some warning signs. And I am just so grateful every day for their proactivity and being willing to say something, to speak up. And because I had parents who understood those dynamics, they listened right away and they immediately took steps to protect me. And in that situation, I got to see very firsthand, even though I didn't even know it at the time, that adults who were trained to understand the dynamics of sexual assault saved me when I could not save myself. And that reality that sometimes it takes somebody from the outside looking in who can see clearly to be able to say, hey, we know you're friends with this person. We know you have a relationship here, but we've got some concern with what we're
Let's
seeing.
talk a little bit about that because some of the
Yeah.
people listening might be interested in learning what some of those signs and symptoms were that were identified. Can you share what those were as
Yeah.
your recollection?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that they noticed, a couple of things, and these were dynamics that my parents picked up on too, but they were so close to this person that they kept kind of second guessing themselves. Am I seeing what I think I'm seeing? Am I being overly sensitive? And so to have adults who are outside that relationship be willing to say, hey, you're not crazy. We see these red flags too. We think something needs to be done was so incredibly impactful. And what they were seeing and what my parents were starting to see was a couple of things that you typically see with predators. There was undue attention being paid to myself and to one other little girl in particular, right? A targeting of myself and this other little girl. There was the typical grooming behaviors of gifts and things that were like little trinkets, things that were given to us that again were just above and beyond how this person typically interacted with other children in the church, special inordinate attention, looking for the ability to engage on a relational context beyond what is normal and healthy for an adult. In this particular case, this individual wanted to give me gifts of clothing, which was one of the things that these trained adults went, that's a little bit odd, right? For this grown man to be wanting to give your daughter clothing, right? Calling my house to talk to me on the phone. Yeah, and again, my parents, we had a relationship with this person. They were a college student. They had been uprooted from actually from their home country. They were an international student. And so it started out very much as hey, we want to make this person feel at home. Let's bring these international students into our families. Let's help acclimate in the culture. Let's be a support system. And so it took all of those good things and it twisted them and it worked them. Some of the other things that these individuals noticed was using what would be normally considered non-sexual physical touch just to continue kind of pushing the boundaries, right? Starting out with side hugs or then getting very close to me physically, really close, tight hugs, pushing those physical boundaries just a little bit further and a little bit further. And we see that happen with predators a lot, where they will start to acclimate their survivors to their potential victims to physical contact that starts out looking very innocent and very normal and just turns the temperature up just a little bit, just a little bit, just a little bit to begin to push those boundaries and to acclimate the child to physical contact. And so they saw all of these warning
Yeah, thank
signs.
you, Rachel. That was really thorough. So we have that as your first unfortunate experience, but then there were others. So maybe whatever you want to share, kind of, so we again have some context for your ability to work through the trauma that you experienced, and still also it's incredible the work you do. So I think what I'm trying to go for is for our listeners who are like, how do I get through this and thrive? I think that's where I'm headed with this question is you've been through a number of situations and you just said they started when you're 7. So what else happened along the way, whatever you want to share? And then how did that impact your trajectory as you went along? And were there any stumbling points too?
Absolutely. So I think the first real stumbling point came in that situation because I had the benefit of trained adults who stood up and said, hey, we think we have a problem. We need to protect her. And I was saved by adults and bystanders who were trained. But when my parents took those steps to protect me, the immediate response from those who were closest in our community was, you've made an allegation without proof. I hadn't disclosed abuse by this person. I had said I was scared of them, that I felt very uncomfortable around them, but I hadn't disclosed abuse. And so we were immediately isolated. And as a very young child, I could sense this shift. And I couldn't tell why was I losing all of these friends in this community, these adults that I considered safe, that had formed my concept of community. They were suddenly so icy and so cold and so distant. And I couldn't figure it out. And when I was 12 and I started to understand more, I started having nightmares and flashbacks and started to understand more about what had taken place, I disclosed to my parents. And that was when I found out why we had lost that church community. And at that point in time, I internalized that first message. If you cannot prove your abuse, do not speak up because it will cost you everything. And that really laid the foundation for questioning my own judgment when I encountered my second abuser. When I was 15, I was a competitive gymnast at a little gym in Kalamazoo, and I was having some serious issues with my back and my wrists. And it really wasn't even a question of, I want to continue competing. It was just, hey, I can't be decrepit at 15 years old, right? We need to figure out what's going on. We need to get help. And even if I don't get to return to the gym, I just need to be a healthy person. And we had tried intervention with a lot of other medical professionals. Nobody seemed to understand gymnastics. They really couldn't give me any help. And then a friend of mine said, or a friend of my mom said, hey, the doctor for the U.S. Olympic team is right up there in Lansing at Michigan State University. He sees local gymnasts all the time. He's just an hour and a half away. Why don't you see if you can get in? And so we went in, and that was when I met Larry. And you walked into his exam room, and it was covered. The walls were covered with pictures of these elite gymnasts, and everybody in Michigan knew who Larry was. He was this respected sports medicine doctor. He held patents, and he had written books, and the rumor that went around Michigan in particular is that there are a couple of other upper level gymnasts, one in particular, who had suffered a really catastrophic injury. And Larry had told this gymnast, if you had been properly conditioned, if you had been properly trained, if your coaches had followed my protocol, this spinal cord injury that you have, this was avoidable. Right. And so I had all this knowledge walking into Larry's room of who he was supposed to be and who the adults that I trusted told me he was. And in my thought process, it was, if he's the doctor for the Olympians, if USA Gymnastics says he's the best, and Michigan State University says he's the best, and all of these adults who are in charge of athlete welfare and child safety say he's the best, how privileged am I to get to see the best?
Right.
Right.
That totally
And
makes
at
sense,
15,
Rachel.
you know,
Yeah. I mean, it's all leading up to, yes, go ahead.
and I think what you see there is just the reality that abusers groom the community around them. Right. And they rely on community support to be able to have access to their victims. And it wasn't just my abuser. It wasn't just Larry that I trusted. I trusted the community around me to do the right thing. And what I didn't know at that time was that Larry had already had multiple reports of sexual abuse against him in a variety of capacities at both Michigan State University and USAG. And those had been systematically ignored. But at 15, I did know that sometimes medical treatment requires things that might not feel particularly comfortable or that might involve private areas. And sometimes you have to do those things, right? And so what Larry essentially would do is he would tell parents, hey, I'm going to work on the muscles that they have. I'm going to do myofascial release. He would use language that mirrored actual medical terminology. And then right there with the parents in the room, he would position himself and position the young child by draping sheets, by where he put his body, by where he had the parents sit, to where they couldn't actually see what he was doing. And he would use one hand to sexually assault and the other hand to do legitimate myofascial release. And what that really did was it used the trust that we all had in our parents against us. None of us knew that our parents couldn't tell what was going on, so we didn't know we needed to say, and our parents didn't know that they needed to ask, right? And he was a very skilled communicator. And so he would use, again, just a lot of these normal grooming and manipulation techniques to be able to do what he needed to do. He would express interest in his patients. How's your school going? What's going on in your life? And engage on a relational level. He would be able to look at the different types of people who were in his office and figure out what they needed to be able to feel at ease. I had parents that were incredibly proactive, and Larry really pinged off of that. He pulled out a skeleton and he showed my mom everything that was going on with my hips and my spine. He just downloaded information on her so that she would feel like he was communicating really thoroughly, right? Other parents, he would have them wait out in the waiting room, or he would give them just little bits of information. He could tell what he needed to do to be able to groom the community that he was a part of and to be able to manipulate and cover up what he was doing.
Yeah.
And one
It's
of the
like,
things I didn't realize.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think let's just stop on that so our listeners can kind of take it all in. Because I think the case, I mean, first, we're totally honored to have your own personal narrative, Rachel. It's really helpful. Sometimes we read in the newspapers and, even my story, I can remember reading about my own life in the newspapers. And I'm like, who wrote this? Because it often wasn't my own truth or narrative. And so I think first, I just want to pause and say how wonderful it is to have just your own authentic voice talking about what was just wretchedly horrible, obviously. And your courage is incredible. Maybe one other thing that's curious in my mind is, can you remember, did your gut ever feel like, oh my gosh, this is so wrong? And were you ever tempted to either talk to Larry himself or your parents? And did it come across your mind like maybe I should say something? I'm curious, like how that felt, or maybe like I can't because this is such a privilege, like you said.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's part of the area where I was actually disadvantaged by the level of knowledge that I had. At that point in time at 15, I knew that pelvic floor therapy was a legitimate medical technique. We had actually talked about going to see a pelvic floor therapist in Kalamazoo because we had a friend who had suffered birth trauma and had very severe issues with her back and her pelvis. And so she had talked to my mom and she had said, "Hey, look, this is a legitimate technique. Here's where the doctors get trained for it. It requires advanced certification. This is what I had done. It was really helpful. If you can't find help for Rachel in these normal medical modalities, consider seeing this physical therapist who does this technique." So when Larry started abusing, my immediate thought process was, "Oh, this must be that pelvic floor therapy technique that I've heard about." He said he was going to work on my do myofascial release. He said I had issues with my pelvis. He used a lot of terminology that was legitimate. And so I had a very distinct thought process. My thought process was, this is clearly something he does regularly. His movements were very smooth and rehearsed. He had an explanation for everything. He knew just how to do it. There was no pause, no hesitation. This is clearly something he does regularly. I know this requires advanced training and degrees and certification. Surely somebody would have described what's going on in this exam room. And if a child described this, surely somebody would make sure that he possessed the correct certification and degrees to be doing the therapy he's doing. Therefore, this must be this therapy that I'd heard about. I very, very intentionally relied not just on Larry's credentials, but on the credentials of the people around him. And what I finally discovered a couple of years later was correct was that I was right, that he was doing it regularly. I was correct that it had been described and disclosed over and over again. Where I was not correct was in believing that his peers and the adults in authority who actually did know the questions to ask would have asked those questions. What we found out decades later when I came forward was that Larry did not possess any of the credentials or the certification. Had anybody who heard any of those disclosures prior to my ever walking in the door have asked even the most basic questions, he could have been stopped when there was maybe a dozen victims instead of a couple hundred.
Right. Oh my gosh, that's a powerful statement, Rachel. It really is. So let's move into so this is your 15-year-old experience. You're still in high school, right? At this point in Michigan. And then I don't know if there was another, I think there was one more incident after that, or more than one. And
Yeah, there were several.
yeah,
He continued to abuse me for more than a year, but there was one point that he did cross the line, and I knew that that was abuse. And when that happened, that was when I experienced that neurobiological response of freezing, which I didn't understand at the time. I couldn't say anything. I was screaming in my head, but I couldn't say anything out loud. I blacked out for a moment, and then I was just so overwhelmed with the confusion of who I believed this person to be and what I thought I had experienced with him for the past year and what he had just done. And trying to reconcile that level of confusion felt almost impossible. Right? And it took quite a while before I even disclosed that portion that I did know. I didn't disclose that until my mom outright asked. And I think that was because I know it was because putting words to something makes it real. And at the point in time that I did understand a portion of what had taken place, I understood that place where he crossed the line, that I knew was sexual assault. I couldn't put that into words because the shame was so great and the confusion was so great. And if I put it into words, I would have to acknowledge it was real. And so silence felt so much safer. And then the level again, just of confusion and disorientation, what I had experienced compared to who he was supposed to be, I didn't even know how to process that or what to make of that.
wow. So yeah, I like the timeline so it helps us stay clear. because I know it took you a while before this whole case unfurled. But let's talk about, so you're graduating high school and going to college in Michigan. Did you go to college in Michigan?
Yeah, so I actually went to law school straight out of high school. California has a provision where you can test into postgraduate studies. So I opted to go that route and just went straight to law school out of high school.
Nice. Okay. So,
It was.
yeah, that's fantastic. So, you said, I think you passed the bar when you were 23 or 4. Is that what you said, around there? But so you graduate from high school, and law school's usually 3 years. Was it a longer process for you? And what were you doing in between?
So I had a gap semester before the school started up, and then it was a 4-year program that I went to rather than a 3-year. Yeah. So I graduated at 23.
Nice. That's wonderful. So now where do you start out with law? Like, are you practicing in California then with a firm or?
Yeah, so I did a variety of things. I met my husband while I was in school, and so we got married shortly after I graduated. And then I worked for some legislative action groups, some public policy groups. I did some legal work for a group up in Canada and did just a variety of things with that degree. And then we eventually moved to Kentucky, and I worked from home while my husband was doing his postgraduate studies.
Okay, so he's a lawyer as well. Or no?
So he actually is pursuing PhD,
A PhD.
finishing up his PhD.
Okay, nice.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and at that point in your career, had you focused on victims' rights or on what you said, advocacy around a particular topic or a passion of yours? So, what were you working on specifically?
Yeah, so again, I did a wide variety of things at this point in time while my husband was doing his master's degree and starting his PhD. It was whatever paid the bills, right? And so some of it was corporate work, some of it was human rights work, some of it was legislative work. I did some academic work for a university up in Michigan, and just really used all of those things. And then on a private level, also engaged in a large degree of advocacy, walked with survivors through their own healing journey, advocated using just social media and the platforms that I had, particularly looking at abuse in conservative and theological circles, which was my home community. And so just really used whatever resources I had to engage on these
That's
issues.
fantastic. Is there one specific project that you took on that you really remember fondly or are really proud of?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are a number of things. What really was closest to my heart, especially at that point in time, was just recognizing the reality that abuse matters and being able to speak on behalf of those who were not being heard or listened to. And so most of that took place to a large degree in my private capacity rather than as paid work, because those are the cases that need the most, right? Cases that are going to pay, that are solid from a legal standpoint. Most of the time, those get picked up by civil attorneys. It's the cases that don't have that in their background, right? Or that are timed out with the statute of limitations, or that are advocating a community that's very cloistered. That's where oftentimes the most support is needed and the most validation is needed. And so there were a couple of cases, particularly in the Christian and conservative context, where survivors were just being systematically silenced and overlooked. And so using my voice and the platform that I had at that time, small though it was, to be able to reach out to leaders and to be able to speak publicly and say, hey, this matters. Look at these people, say their names, look at what's gone on here. How are we treating these people? And just being able to take a very multifaceted approach to understanding trauma and the community response to it, to a large degree, that really was done in a private capacity, because they didn't have a case where they could rally a civil case or a lot of press coverage. And they needed that kind of support more than anything.
That's wonderful, Rachel. Extremely, noble of you to take on all this extra work. I think that's one of the things that, a lot of people don't understand if they're used to everything needs a paycheck, and that some of the things that we do are just because we love helping and making a difference. So I definitely feel the same way. So let's talk about the biggest part of your life. So what's some people might not know what a whistleblower means or how that comes about. So let's talk about that, what that means to you and what it felt like and how you did it.
Absolutely. So a whistleblower is really somebody who sounds the alarm, right? Who blows that whistle, who says, hey, there's something really wrong here and we need to deal with it. And most of the time that has to be done very publicly, because when you are dealing with somebody who occupies a position of power and has the ability to control the public narrative, the only way to change that narrative and to reach others is to be able to wrest control from that individual. And that was very much the case with Larry. Once I started to figure out what I had experienced with him and started to do some research on what legitimate pelvic floor therapy would look like, my mom and I was around 17 years old. My mom and I were walking around the block, and she goes, well, what do we do with this information? We didn't know how bad it was yet, but we knew that some things, the lines had been crossed, and we knew that he wasn't going to stop, right? And that I wasn't going to be the first, and I certainly wasn't going to be the last. And at that point in time, at 17, I said, one voice is never going to be enough. There's no way this hasn't been disclosed before. I will have to have press coverage to be able to make this happen, right? To be able to levy enough public pressure to wrest control of the narrative, to have a hope that he gets prosecuted, that other survivors are strong enough to come forward, to be able to show the pattern and what he's doing. He's going to have to be met where he's most confident, and that's in the public eye. And so my mom and I actually talked about literally going down to the local news station and seeing if they would take this story. But at that time frame, I mean, decades ago, press coverage wasn't like what it is now. And I had no idea at 17 how to even make that happen. And so we talked about that. But really what I did for the next 16 years was I watched and waited for that opportunity. I monitored Larry's career. I got a hold of my medical records that had all the evidence retained if I wanted to come forward, if I ever had that chance to come forward. It wasn't that I wasn't willing. It was that there were literally no options to do so. Right. At one point in time, I disclosed to a family friend who was married to a police officer, was engaged to a police officer. Those individuals knew my family. They wanted to do the right thing. And even in that context, I was not able to get them to believe, hey, I know what I'm talking about.
I'm just right now, I was a little stunned when you said you watched and waited for 16 years. That's incredible. I think that is extraordinary patience on your part. And I can't imagine being so patient. But I know you had to be, right? You had no other option, as you said. You just had to watch and wait. And so what was the tipping point? When did you say, like, I've got enough now? And then what happened?
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. So I had told my husband when we first started dating, I said, hey, look, this is in my background. If there's ever an opportunity for me to speak up and be believed, I'm going to take it, and it will be a national news story. So you need to know that if we keep dating and we eventually, you need to know that this could be coming at some point in time, because I knew what it would look like. And he was, hey, like, I am here for that. I will help you. We will do whatever it takes. And so we went into marriage knowing that this was always a possibility. And what happened was the Indy Star did an expose on USA Gymnastics and their systemic cover-up of sexual abuse by coaches. And what was astonishing to me when I opened that news article and I read it, it just happened to be trending in my Facebook newsfeed. I clicked on it and I read the article. Larry wasn't in there. There was no mention of medical aspects. It was solely focused on the coaches. But there were a couple of hallmarks that I had been looking for. One of which was that the Indy Star was in USAG's hometown, and they were willing to poke that beast, right? They were willing to invest the time and the financial resources, knowing the cost that they might endure for blowing the whistle on such a powerful organization. They put the story together in a way that showed me they clearly understood trauma dynamics and abuse dynamics, and that they could explain them in a way that people would understand. And the story was trending. And this was really critical, because the reality is that sexual abuse in gymnastics was not an open secret. It wasn't a secret at all. There had been literal books written on how bad sexual abuse was in gymnastics by coaches, and nobody cared, right? It was right out there in the open. But for the first time, this article was trending, and there was a level of public outrage being generated. And so I read that. I very quickly researched the team that had put that together, looked at some of their history and their background, and I immediately wrote to the team and I said, I have something I need to tell you. I've waited for 16 years. This is all the evidence that I have. I will come forward as publicly as necessary if you can just get the truth out. And I gave them everything I had and told them, and literally said, look, I will be the face. I will make myself the target. I will do whatever needs to be done if you can just get the truth out. That was what I had been waiting for.
Do you think that what I'm also learning when you describe all this, Rachael, is you had a really supportive husband. He knew what he was getting into. So you had at least two tremendous advocates that are some of the most important people for most of us. And that's a real, I think, blessing for you, because without those two, it might have been much, much more difficult. And not, I mean, your intellectual capacity, I think, and determination emotionally, and all of it is clear. You're so, your convictions are strong. But what role do you think the two of them played in when things got hard? Were they there for you? And what did they do? Since some of our listeners are wondering how to best support a survivor.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right, Katie. Those dynamics were the game changers for me. I did have an incredibly supportive family. My mom, my dad, my siblings, and my husband, they were in my corner and they had my back. And sometimes what that meant was literally just saying, "Hey, you can do this. We are here for you. We're going to be here no matter what comes. You can do this, and we've got your back." Knowing that statistically I was likely to fail and fail very publicly. And honestly, that's really what I thought would happen, because I knew the statistics. Out of every 300 rapes reported to the police, on average, between 5 and 25 on a given year are going to result in criminal conviction and jail time. What I knew was statistically likely is that I would come forward and I would fail very publicly on an international stage. But it was the right thing to do, and it was the first time I had a chance. And that aspect of how do we provide that kind of support and care for survivors so that they can come forward, I think is absolutely critical. Most of the time I get asked the question, how do we help survivors be willing? And in my experience, survivors are willing to speak up. They want to be able to stop an abuser. They want to be able to tell the truth. They literally have no mechanism for doing so and no community support to surround them. And part of the conversation, a big part of the conversation that my husband and I had was, we know what this is going to do to me. We know what it's going to do to our family, but I can live through this. And somebody else literally might not survive what I'm about to go through. I am going to choose to do this because I can do this and not die. And somebody else might not have that opportunity. I don't want anybody else to be faced with the choice that I have right now. I have the support system that very few survivors have. And that's the reality. And I think that is one of the most important things that comes out of our case, and really any case, is that conversation of understanding what survivors face when they speak up, and then looking at how do we create a community, a legal system, a support system and structure, a society where they are safe to actually raise their voices, because it's not lack of willingness on the survivor's part. It's literally lack of ability. There are no safe channels for survivors to speak up and no safe community for them to do so more often than not.
Mm-hmm. The believability and support are so, so fundamentally important. So I'm glad we talked about that. So now things are rolling. And how fast was the ignition combust? Like everything goes like big time. And I guess that's my first question. Is it within 24 hours, a week? And then social media, how did that play a role in the spread of the word on the street, I guess?
Yeah. Yeah. So it was really fast and agonizingly slow all at the same time. I think it took, yeah, it took, I mean, it's kind of that, like, you're waiting to see what's going to happen, right? So I wrote to the Indy Star. It was about 48 hours later that I got maybe 24 hours later, I got just a form back. Hey, thanks for your tip. We'll be in touch if we think we can do anything. And then it was a couple days after that they wrote and they said, hey, somebody else gave us the same guy. They're not ready to go on record yet. They don't feel like they could be part of a story, but it gives it enough that we might be able to move forward. Can we sit down and talk? And so they came over, the Indy Star team came to our house within 10 days of my sending that email, a week to 10 days. I gave them all my medical records, let them photograph everything, sat down and recorded a video interview, and just did everything I could possibly do. But we still didn't know if it was going to air. And part of what could potentially make it air was if somebody filed a police report, if there was some kind of legal backing. And I thought I was statutated out because I didn't know that there had been a legislative change in Michigan that would allow me to file a police report. But in the course of doing research for the Indy Star article, I caught that legislative change and I realized, oh, I can do that. I can file the police report too. And so I did the research to figure out what jurisdiction I was going to be in, found out I had to report to Michigan State University where Larry worked, which just filled me with joy. It was great. But I called right away, scheduled time to sit down with the detective, wanted to make sure that I did it in person. I wanted to be able to read the detective's body language, see their facial expressions, and basically analyze everything myself. I was really checking out the police department as much as they were checking me out. I wanted to do it in person.
The evidence, Rachel, you did it all. You did everything. You're one of a kind, I think. I mean, I meet lots and lots of survivors. I'm sure you do too, but I think it's admirable how strong you are and how capable you are at thinking through all the different processes and what you orchestrated the whole thing. Yeah. So, what were some of the hard parts in that process for you, if there were any? Or did you feel like I'm always kind of going in the right direction?
So I knew what needed to be done. That question of how do I do it was not a question because I had known literally from the time I was 17, it's going to take press coverage. It's going to take all these things. Being a trained attorney, I knew what type of evidence. I reached out to myself to a local prosecutor who had actually been my third grade Sunday school teacher and just said, hey, this is what I'm getting ready to do. Can you give me your professional opinion? Double check the law for me, make sure I've got this right. So I wrote an open letter to the detectives and said, hey, this is why I can file it. It's not timed out from the statute of limitations. Here's the citation for where the code changed. Here's the category of offense I fall under. Here's all the evidence I have to prove these different categories, and literally just kind of laid it out. In letter form, I reached out to all of the individuals that I had given prior disclosures to let them know that I was going to be doing this and get their permission to pass on their contact information to the detective. So I brought everything I had with me to Michigan, as well as a letter from this prosecuting attorney. He said, Rachel, justice is God's work, and I will do this with you. And he offered to write a letter on my behalf, vouching for my credibility and my character to hand carry with me to the detective's office. And that meant the world to me, because outside of my family, it was the first person who was willing to leverage his platform, his credentials, his character, his integrity on my behalf and step into that mess with me when I couldn't give him anything in return. Right. And I'm so deeply grateful for that. And so in terms of what I knew needed to be done, there was nothing that surprised me. I knew what it was going to look like. What I was surprised by was how unique a situation I found myself in that I had people who cared every step of the way. I had a phenomenal team at the Indy Star who understood abuse dynamics, treated me with respect, treated my story with respect, and put that story together in a way that people could understand. It did everything it needed to do. The way they wrote that story did everything it needed to do. I had a police detective in Lieutenant Andrea Mumford who treated me like I mattered. She had no idea what this case was going to become, but she believed it mattered. And she was so proactive and she was so victim-centered. And she did everything she could to return agency to me through that process. She gave Larry my maiden name first instead of my married name so that he wouldn't know right away. I'd be able to track me down right away. She let me know when he was going to talk to him. She just let me know, hey, he came in, we had an interview, whatever she could tell me, she would tell me so that she could restore agency to me during that process. When we moved on far enough and we got a prosecutor, Angela Povolitis, Angela was so incredibly skilled with her prosecutorial work and her knowledge of the case and Michigan law. And she was so passionate about doing the right thing and fighting for us. And she had done it for both of them. They had done the right thing over and over and over again so many times when nobody was watching and nobody could see, and it looked like it didn't matter and it didn't make the headlines. And when I came forward, they did the same thing for me when it was just me. And then that blossomed into a case that literally changed the world. But I got the privilege of watching those little decisions over and over and over again. It could never have happened without every single person who was part of that story. And again, I think that's part of what drives this conversation of what do we have to actually get to a result that looks something like justice and create some level of change. We have to have all of these different pieces, and most survivors don't have that. And I couldn't create that. Right? I could do everything right and wind up with a detective who didn't care, and it dies right there on the table. I could get a detective who cares, but a prosecutor who's not skilled and doesn't care, and it dies right there on the prosecutor's table. We had to have people who cared and who were trained and who were full of integrity every single step of the way and who moved like it mattered. When the CSAM was found on Larry's hard drives, the most just phenomenal thing about that is that Andrea got those warrants so quickly. Had she been but 2 hours later, the garbage would have picked up those hard drives and the child porn on Larry's hard drives would have never been found. She got those warrants so much faster than we typically see law enforcement move. In fact, Larry had been reported to the FBI 15 months before I came forward. There were 3 different FBI divisions involved, and he had been reported to Michigan State University before I came forward, and the detective that got that case previously had completely dropped the ball on it, had done very poor investigative work, hadn't done what they needed to do, hadn't interviewed the experts they needed to interview. She interviewed Larry for 2.5 hours. The whole interview's out on YouTube now. She interviewed Larry for 2.5 hours, and he walked out of the room with her giving him the verbal assurances that his story sounded really credible and she was sure it was going to be cleaned up quickly. In 15 months, 3 FBI offices and a Michigan State Police Department managed to do precisely nothing. In 15 months, Andrea Mumford and Angela Povolitis secured a guilty plea on behalf of 13 survivors and the right for 156 survivors to speak in court.
That's incredible.
The same amount of time, 2 totally different results.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that amazing?
It is. It's devastating and encouraging all at once, Rachel, because even if you just, I wish you had it all written. I mean, you probably already did. Did you write it all down? Are you doing a book? Like all these tips? Yes. Oh, good. Okay. Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, I don't want to, I feel like you could talk for 4 hours about this. I'm thinking, what else would we like to tell the listeners? What would you like to tell them? I mean, then they can read the book. But I'm curious, I guess on the emotional, the personal level, all those wonderful things that came together, when I listen to you, I don't think you're done. Like, it's not like, I feel like you're good with how you handled this, but I feel like there's still lots of urgency that I'm hearing from you about more stuff that's on your to-do list. So maybe let's talk about why, some people would be like, okay, I'm all set. I did enough. But you're someone who, maybe it's because you went through several different experiences, or maybe it's because, at age 10, you want to be a lawyer. But, maybe what do you think is driving you and where are you going to head next? Other than, I think you wrote, you have 4 kids, which sounds like a lot of maintenance stuff too. But tell us a little bit about what's next for Rachel.
I really am passionate about taking a very multifaceted approach to combating sexual abuse and having proper crisis response. Because I think one of the things that we get to see in our case is you get to see all the dynamics that survivors face and what makes the difference blown up in this huge form. We get to look back on it and go, okay, here's why it didn't work the first time. Here's why it did the second time. Look at the difference in the detective work between the first detective at MSU and the FBI offices and Andrea. Look at the difference in how the prosecutors engaged here and here. Same time frame, 2 totally different results. Let's train our law enforcement better. Let's equip them with the resources they need. Let's train our prosecutors better. Let's look at what happened at Michigan State University and USAG. Let's look at what went wrong on a corporate and an institutional level. And let's fix that the next time, right? So I do a lot of things. I work with law enforcement and conferences and Leo training, and I work with attorneys groups, everything from trauma-informed investigative practices to, hey, let's talk about corporate health and compliance. And what do you do as a corporate attorney when you're faced with something? And what does it mean to be a fiduciary? And when you're that attorney in the room and you're forming corporate policy and institutional health, or you get that call, what do you tell the organization to do? What's the right thing to do? How do we do the right thing in the wisest way possible? We also can see all kinds of breakdowns across the medical ethics spectrum. So I do teaching and training at medical conferences. How do we engage with survivors who have been through trauma? Getting good medical care is so hard for survivors of trauma because you've got those power dynamics between you and the doctor. You've lost your agency a lot of times. It's hard to find your voice. So training medical professionals just on how to give good care to trauma survivors, but also, again, on medical ethics and corporate health and compliance, and this reality that it takes somebody on the inside to speak up. I do training for our military academies on sexual assault prevention and ethical decision-making and leadership dynamics. I work with nonprofits. I work with legislatures because it really does take all of those pieces to come together. And also really driving that community conversation of how do we become a society where survivors are safe to speak up? How do we provide that level of care and support for those who have been through so much? And that encompasses a huge range of things, right? Understanding the neurobiology of trauma so that we can answer questions like, well, if that's true, why didn't you say it earlier? Why didn't you scream when it was happening? How could that happen in this type of context? Understanding trauma dynamics, understanding the neurobiology of trauma, equipping survivors to understand what they've been through and to have words and categories. For me, on my own healing journey, that was so incredibly important. Understanding the neurobiology of trauma so that I could understand why I couldn't scream, why I couldn't fight back. It didn't mean that I didn't want it. It didn't, or that I wanted it. It didn't mean that I didn't care. It was so powerful for me. Understanding what a flashback was.
I
And
have a
yeah,
question about that, Rachel. I think I like how you're talking about understanding the neurobiology of trauma. And I guess where I head is, what role do you think that being able to understand or research or read about what's going on in our brains, our bodies, what role did that play, or do you think it plays in the healing process overall, and for yourself or others? The understanding, not like the study of it almost, that's different from going to see a counselor, unless the counselor's also providing you with the research too. But it sounds like you went out and did the research yourself. So how did that help?
it was really important for me because I carried, like so many survivors, I carried incredible guilt for not being able to stop my abuse. How could I have been so stupid? Why didn't I understand? Why couldn't I fight back? Why couldn't I say something at the moment of abuse? Why did it take me so long to disclose? How come I couldn't put words to it? Why am I experiencing this? I mean, I didn't have a word for it at the time, but it was hypervigilance. Why am I'm being overly dramatic? Why can't I just get over this? I carried so much guilt for my own abuse, but then I carried so much guilt for not being able to heal from it. And so understanding the neurobiology of trauma, being able to go, okay, this is what's going on in my brain. This is the hormone cascade that's coming from it. This is why my body's responding this way in this context. I'm not crazy. I'm not being weak. I'm not being overdramatic. I have an actual physical injury. I just can't see that injury. And being able to go, okay, how would I treat a physical injury? If I could see the wound, I would recognize that physical therapy is really important. I can correlate that to needing trauma therapy and realize I'm not weak for needing it. I'm not weak for needing help, right? We can talk about that in terms of medication, right? I was very privileged and blessed to not end up needing medication, but most survivors do to regain equilibrium. And there's so much guilt and stigma attached with that. But if we could see the injury, we would go, yeah, I understand why medication is going to be needed to help alleviate the symptoms so that you can do the work of healing, so that you can regain some sense of normalcy, right? So if we could see it, what would you say about medication? Okay, it's a real wound. You just can't see it. How would you treat somebody who had a physical injury you could see? Okay, so let's translate that to the physical injury that you can't see. I think that knowledge is so powerful because it helps us understand. It also helps us unwind. When I was able to start identifying, okay, this sensation right here, this is hypervigilance. Why am I feeling hypervigilance? This neural pathway is getting triggered because this is what I experienced. How do I unwind that and start retraining those neural pathways? How do I ground myself to start calming down that response? I could understand what I was experiencing so that I could identify it and process it and figure out a way forward. I think that when you can peel back those layers like that, it helps you know, A, first and foremost, you're not crazy, you're not weak, you're not making it up, you're not being hypersensitive. You have a real wound that deserves to be grieved and is an actual injury that you can identify without feeling the pressure to minimize it or to mitigate it or pretend it doesn't exist. And then it equips you with the tools to understand what's going on so that you can understand a good healing path forward. Knowledge is so powerful.
Thank you, Rachel. That was perfectly said. I'm so grateful that we had this chance to talk. And I know we've been going almost an hour, so we're at the end of our time together, but I'm excited. So tell the audience a little bit about the book and where to find it, or anything else you want to share so they can continue to follow your journey and pay attention to the wonderful work you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wrote two children's books, What is a Little Girl Worth and What is a Little Boy Worth? They do incorporate some of the more faith-based elements that come from my story, but it's really just that question of, where does your value come from? And can it be taken away by something that was done for you, or done to you, right? And then the memoir, which is the story of my childhood and then everything that transpired through my abuse and the case. And really my hope with that was to do a couple of things. I think it's a phenomenal story, right? You can look at the detective work and the prosecutorial work, and just getting to get a behind the scenes look at what happens in those types of situations is just a phenomenal story because there were so many incredible people involved with it. And I wanted to be able to highlight that, but also to be able to really lift the veil on what's happening with survivors and what they face and the thought processes and the emotions for a couple of reasons. One, for survivors to be able to be able to say, okay, I'm not alone. I'm not crazy. I'm not making it up. I have words to express what I'm experiencing here. I can help identify. I have knowledge to draw from now. And also for those who are walking alongside them to be able to go, okay, now I understand. I'm starting to grasp better what you're walking through, right? Because so much of the time, it's the survivors who are in the position of having to educate their own support network. And that's an exhausting reality. And we really need to start working as a community on understanding these dynamics better so that survivors aren't continually in the position of trying to heal themselves and trying to use their own story to educate the people that they need support from. And so I really was trying as much as I could to accomplish all of those objectives, tell a really good, compelling story, because it is, but also to be able to really bring a name and a face and the reality of abuse and what survivors face, both for survivors and for that support network. And especially to honor the voices of so many who were involved in this process, because it wasn't just one voice, right? Like I get that all the time. Look at what one voice could accomplish. One voice didn't accomplish this. It was one voice plus a phenomenal team of journalists, plus an awesome detective, plus a phenomenal police chief, plus an incredible prosecutor, plus 156 women who came forward and said, me too.
Mm-hmm.
One voice could have never gotten the result that we got in our case. It took everybody. And to be able to understand it and to really see laid out in front of you the power of everybody's choices, because we all have those choices as community members. And to know that our choices matter and our choices bring incredible impact. We have the ability to create incredible change when we make those little tiny choices that come together to generate real reform.
Oh, perfectly said. Thank you, Rachel. That was wonderful. And I guess I remind all our listeners, what Rachel said is kind of what we're doing collectively with our voices in this podcast and with Take Back the Night. The walks and marches and the signs and the shirts and the physical presence of us coming together is so very important. So Rachel, you highlighted everything that we do at Take Back the Night and so well that it is all of us together walking and a whole community coming together and standing together and saying like, we're going to do our best. We're going to keep doing our best and get until we get this right. And it is going to be a long process, but thank you, Rachel, for being such a significant part of bringing awareness and not just to your own case, but really the whole process as you described in our interview. I think you certainly gave a call to action to all of those around the survivor too. So thank you. Thank you. And for our listeners, please continue to do self-care. Rachel gave you bunches of ideas today about how to maybe learn more about those. I like the internal wounds that are really legitimate and need equal, if not more attention in some ways, because we know perhaps less about them and how to treat them. So lastly, I always like to remind our listeners, we are building a cool shop, the Katie Collective, that has all kinds of healing, I would say products, but it's really more like wearables. Like each episode title is now part of something you can get on a shirt or, just if someone means a lot like Rachel does, I hope you'll go look up her episode and, do a little homage to Rachel's courage and also obviously her memoir. And if you have kids, I'm sure those children's books would be fantastic too. And lastly, since Rachel is an attorney, I remind our listeners, we do have the legal support hotline with trauma-informed attorneys all over the United States who are ready and willing to be patient and do all the good work that Rachel described that was, utilized in her case. So again, thank you for joining us, Rachel. And to all listeners, continue please to do great self-care and be kind to yourselves.